Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us for tonight's webinar. I'm thrilled to have back to our webinar. I think, Steve, I think you're the only two-time attendee here. Our first webinar that we did with Dr. Choi was on March 30th, really right in the heart of early COVID. And we're really thrilled to have Dr. Choi back. First, I'd like to thank the Yale Alumni Health Network for co-sponsoring the event with us. My name is Sam Hendel. I'm one of the co-founders of Accelerate Yale. My day job, I'm portfolio manager and president of a boutique investment firm, Levin Easterly Partners. And I also, by night, I co-founded Dataminer about 11 years ago, and also do a lot with Accelerate Yale as co-founder and Yale Angels. And I'm really thrilled to have with me tonight Dr. Stephen Choi. Dr. Choi is the Chief Quality Officer, Vice President and Associate Dean of the Yale School of Medicine and Yale New Haven Health System, which is the largest healthcare provider in the state of Connecticut. And he's responsible for developing and executing the single unified strategy for healthcare across the entire system. And Dr. Choi and his team, they're responsible for preventing all hospital-acquired infections, preventing patient harm, and improving clinical outcomes across all their patients. And Dr. Choi and his team, of course, have been extremely involved in the COVID response, both for Yale University and the Yale New Haven Health System. He's regularly appeared on national and local television, including CNN, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, and a few more that you wrote me in your bio, Steve. And you might recognize Steve also from press conferences. He is a regular attendee at Governor Lamont's press conferences here in Connecticut. And he's been instrumental in fighting COVID here around the country, and also giving me some advice when I have some questions. And is also, of course, a dear friend of mine. So Dr. Choi, thank you so much for being here. I apologize to everyone listening that we both are big Jets fans and are showing off our jerseys behind me here. But maybe I'll start it off. You know, it was clearly a very different world the last time we did this, and you know, now we're dealing with back to school, the very challenging decision to send our children back to elementary school, to college. I mean, Steve, I would love to hear your thoughts on you know, the risks inherent in doing this, what you're doing with your family. You know, any advice you have for parents that are, you know, struggling with this decision, or just ways we can stay safe in the process of sending our kids.
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me back, Sam. It's a pleasure. And I want to thank the Yale Alumni Group and Accelerate Yale and the Yale Health Network for hosting this event. And I think your first question, it might be the primary question that most of the attendees are thinking of that have tuned in tonight. So I think what we have to anticipate in the upcoming weeks and months is that this is the sort of most vulnerable time for all of us, including our children and our families and our extended families, for what will be a likely uptick in cases. You know, with my kids, they are going to go back to school. And as you know, for those of you who live in Connecticut, every school district has been given the opportunity to set up guidelines for how they'll bring students back. Parents in most districts have a choice of going remote or going in person. But it's really back to the basics, which is, you know, make sure your kids are wearing masks at all times, social distancing, and then hand hygiene. Those are the three most critical steps. Now, that is a lot easier said than done. And as you know, as we have young kids, it's hard for a young child, whether they're 5 or 7, and even teenagers, to wear a mask at all times. So, you know, one of the things that I've recommended to parents is that if you have not been practicing wearing a mask at home or out, this is the time to do it. The last thing you want to put your child through is put him or her through an environment where they're not comfortable wearing a mask. And that could be for 3 hours. In some schools, it's a full day. So, make sure you wear the mask at home, and make sure you note and point out that the masks are fitted properly. Make sure it's not hanging below the nose, which many adults do as well. And then just iterate to the children that they've got to keep their distance at school. And then beyond that, there's very little that parents can do. The rest is really up to the schools, right? And how the schools have managed their facilities to distance children, to make sure that there's adequate supply of hand sanitizer throughout the building, and then to safely space the kids, whether it's in the classroom, those schools that are going to provide lunch or snack time, and certain events where kids are going to gather, whether it's outside or inside. You just got to make sure there's adequate spacing.
And how about at home with parents? I think we've all spent a lot of time outside seeing friends at a distance, and that's been really nice this summer. Is there anything the parents should be doing differently now that a lot of kids are going to school, especially parents? Communities where a lot of parents are sending their kids at the same time, and you have these, you have all the pods. A lot of these schools are having pods of kids, half a class or a group together. Any advice for parent behavior during this unusual period?
Sure. So there's really nothing that will guarantee a zero risk interaction apart from staying apart from all families or all people outside your home. But I think exactly what you said is what parents and families should continue doing, certainly throughout the fall and in the winter where we expect cases to go up. So distancing outside is the best means for social interaction. I would make it a practice to not go into other people's homes, but if you do need to for cases such as, if you're at a friend's house and you've got to use the restroom, then put a mask on and go in and use the restroom. Make sure you wipe down the surfaces. But continuing to do exactly what you said is probably the best measure that we could take as parents, and then teaching our kids to do that as well.
Great. And we'll certainly get to some questions on masks later on in our talk and vaccines as well. I have sort of two more questions on the school topic. One, what do you think happens if there's a case in your school, in your child's school? What's going to be the result? Is the whole school going to shut down? Are they going to try to shut it down by pods? I assume it's all different by district, but any thoughts around what happens if there's a case?
Sure. Well, ultimately, in the state of Connecticut, and for most states, that decision will be determined at the local state department level. They do have reporting obligations to the state health department, but whatever that local district determines is the safest thing for the children, and of course the faculty and the staff that work at the school. They'll be the final decision makers. So there's really no magic number in terms of if you hit this number, you're going to have to shut down. But certainly if there's one child that tests positive and they do proper contact tracing and determine that there's really no other risk, then that would not be a means to immediately shut down the school. So I know a lot of parents out there wondering, and they're concerned if one child tests positive, that the whole school is shut down. That would be highly unlikely, Sam.
Great, thank you, Steve. And just really quickly on sort of the transmission, I've read about receptors, that kids have different types of, not as many receptors. And what's sort of your view on kids' ability to get the virus and then also transmit to family members?
Sure. So there have been a number of recent reports since the outbreak back in December and January overseas. What's clear is that children definitely have a milder form of the disease. Can they have a severe form? Absolutely. It does seem to be restricted to children with comorbidities or chronic medical conditions. But what is of concern is that children can certainly transmit and carry the virus, particularly in an asymptomatic state. So what that means is you could have what is a regularly normal appearing child, not exhibiting the symptoms of the classic COVID syndrome that let's say you and I may exhibit if we're sick, but they can transmit it. And the most recent study said, kids 12 and above, sort of high school, middle school children are more likely to transmit than kids that are in the primary elementary schools. So that's a risk, and that's something we've discovered recently in some of the case reports. And then most recently, and I'm sure many of the panelists have heard that there's described or a validated case in Hong Kong of a gentleman who's been infected twice with a different strain. And we've known that this was a risk. We know, like as many other RNA or respiratory viruses, the virus has an ability to mutate. And so I think that's another risk, but it's extremely low given the numbers of people that have been infected. We haven't seen an exorbitant number of reinfections. So we're optimistically hoping that that's a rare occurrence.
Great. So this summer we had the very, very acute period, especially here in the Northeast. That has certainly calmed down. Then, of course, I don't know if you call it a second wave or, kind of the rest of the country, unfortunately catching up to us here. What can we learn from, the experience of, of sort of the present time, what we're seeing in the Sun Belt, Florida, Texas, Arizona, et cetera?
Yeah. So I think most epidemiologists and certainly, our experts in infectious diseases and in the public health school at Yale have all felt that those states likely, and in some cases very certainly, reopen their businesses or areas where they could have decreased transmission too early. And I think that was the biggest challenge. And in a lot of the contact tracing cases of the super spreaders down in the South and the Midwest, they've been traced back to indoor dining, indoor bars. And so I think it's activities like that we're still trying to discourage for the most part here in Connecticut, and have been doing pretty well for the last 4 months consistently, that will allow us to enjoy a relatively COVID-free fall. And that's what we're hoping for too. I think we've done a tremendous job here in the state of Connecticut, and I'm very happy to see that we've been able to enjoy a pretty safe summer for the most part.
Great. And so you're really indoor dining and bars seem to be the area that have caused the most spread. I love your one thing. The economy is clearly a very important factor here.
Sure.
Delivery restaurants and outdoor. I think I know your opinion. I love to hear it though, and sort of ways we can kind of keep our businesses in business.
Sure. No, and that's vital to the overall health of the community, right? For the state. So, we encourage folks to order out if possible, or have delivery. And if you're going to eat at a restaurant, we highly recommend that you eat outdoors. And of course, the safest thing is to eat at home. And I think one of the highlights of COVID is that people have really enjoyed cooking at home, and enjoying the company of their family members, and experimenting with different recipes and so forth. But the safest thing is to eat at home. But if you are going to choose to eat out, and we're not going to reprimand you or shame you for eating out, I would highly recommend that you eat outdoors. And of course, if you're going to go indoors to use the restroom, that you put on your mask.
Perfect. Now I was joking to you the other day that we just bought 2 heat lamps for the long, lonely, dark winter that could happen here. What's your outlook?
Great choice.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to think of other things. At the end of this, you can give me a list of things I can buy for this winter here. But love to hear your thoughts on fall and winter, and is the virus more transmissible during colder weather, and what should we sort of look out for the next 4, 5, 6 months?
Sure. So most of what we're seeing are based on observations, and we could look back from the countries in the Southern Hemisphere and how they fared during their summer months. And it clearly appears that the virus is less likely to transmit during the summer or the warmer climates or the warmer months. So in that respect, we're anticipating that, during the fall and the winter that the virus will have a higher transmission rate. That being said, there's also behavioral patterns in the fall and the winter that increase the likelihood of the virus transmitting throughout a community. And that's because people tend to gather indoors. So to your point, it's a big risk if we see more groups of individuals and communities, families having parties, outside of their sort of inner pod where, they're exposed to other people, particularly those who've traveled from high-risk areas. So that's a risk. And I think, in the fall and winter, we just got to remind ourselves that, we did a great job controlling the transmission rates during the summer, and we need to continue practicing those behaviors.
Perfect. Let's get into treatment. So therapeutics, it's now been 6 months of.
I promised Alex she could Zoom on. You could say hi, then you got to go back. Okay.
Hey, Alex, what's up, buddy? So for the audience, Alex and my daughter Zoe are besties, so we see her a lot.
So we've learned a ton, and I think because of that, I'm optimistic that, whether you want to call it the second wave or part two, is not nearly going to be as dramatic or severe as the wave that we felt in the spring. So there are a lot of therapeutics that we trialed during a health crisis such as a pandemic. So there are a lot of drugs that we used last year that we're no longer using, and we have found that are not effective, and more importantly, that they could be dangerous. So the therapies that we've stuck with and that are still part of the Yale protocol are steroids, which is an anti-inflammatory, and that's really essential because probably the most invasive part of this infection is the inflammatory response that the host mounts against the virus. So it's not necessarily the virus itself replicating inside your lungs that's causing most of the damage. It's actually your own body reacting to that virus. And so we have steroids. We have another monoclonal antibody, tocilizumab, that targets a certain protein to suppress that inflammatory response. We've been using the drug remdesivir, which has gotten a lot of public attention. That drug was originally used as an antiviral therapy for Ebola virus many years ago. And then we have got other sort of, non-medical therapeutics that we've found have been very effective. And for those of you who've been paying attention, there's this maneuver called proning, where you actually put patients in the hospital who are severely ill on their stomachs. And that helps the oxygen get to the lungs effectively, and then prohibits or mitigates some of the lung disease that these patients have as well. And then there's a lot of buzz around the convalescent plasma, and that's getting blood samples or donors who've recovered from COVID. And theoretically, those patients should have antibodies that are effective in neutralizing COVID. And when we transfuse them, there has been some benefit to certain populations, particularly if you give it early. But we're still, undergoing, hundreds of clinical trials, and we'll learn more. But we've learned quite a bit from last year. So I feel optimistic that we're going to be much more prepared this year.
So hydroxychloroquine, sounds like all the buzz there is.
Yeah.
Is that?
I have a colleague here who's causing a lot of buzz too. So our position at Yale is that there are certain case studies that have shown that there might be some benefit with hydroxychloroquine, but with the randomized controlled trial, which is really our gold standard to determine if a therapeutic or an intervention or a treatment is effective. That has shown that there's no clinical effectiveness with hydroxychloroquine. And what that means is, if I give you hydroxychloroquine, I give another patient a placebo, there's no difference between those groups, and you randomize those groups. So, it doesn't matter, what sort of demographic or comorbidity you have, you just randomize back and forth between patients. But furthermore, we've actually found that giving hydroxychloroquine, particularly with some other medications, can be deadly. So we do not use that at Yale, and I would say most academic centers do not use that as part of their treatment regimen.
So let's get to testing. Clearly, the country still has some issues in supply chain. Would love to hear, what's going on in Connecticut and sort of what you're seeing around the country around testing. And also would love to hear about the Yale MBA partnership on saliva testing and your views, and I think that got a FDA emergency authorization, but what does that actually, and same with convalescent plasma, what does that actually mean?
Sure. So we could start with the last subject, which is the saliva test. So Nate Grubau's lab at the School of Public Health at Yale, patented the saliva test. And so that test allows for patients to just provide a saliva sample, which is a lot easier to collect than a nasopharyngeal swab, which is a pretty deep swab. So for those of you in the audience who've had that test, I've had multiple tests, simply because we're testing healthcare workers at Yale. It's very painful. It's very uncomfortable. So there's a lot of ease with that saliva test. And it also does not require what we call the RNA extraction. So we're trying to extract that COVID protein from the saliva isn't part of that testing process. And so that helps with a lot of the supplies that have limited, mass testing throughout the world. But it's for, emergency use only right now. So it doesn't mean it's gone through the proper regulatory channels that a FDA approved test per se would. So we still stand by, the nasal pharyngeal swab as the gold standard for the PCR. And we've also found that, the saliva test, isn't as sensitive as that nasopharyngeal PCR. And for a disease like this, we want to have the high sensitivity. And what that means is you don't want to have false negatives. So if I have a margin of false negatives, then I will miss a certain percentage of patients who are actually positive, but falsely test negative. The flip side of that is, you could have a low specificity where you test people as positive when in fact they're negative. But for a pandemic, you'd rather err on the side that, you don't miss the positives and you may, call some people out that actually aren't infected. So that's some of the limitations. And, the School of Public Health has an agreement, arrangement with the NBA, and they're handling the samples from players and the staff and personnel to do those tests. But we currently do not have it available for mass testing as we do with the PCR nasal pharyngeal test.
And there's a lot of Q&A, and we will get to audience Q&A a little later on in our talk. There is a question here that just popped up, and it's very timely. What do you think about the new CDC advice to only test symptomatic patients?
Who asked that?
Jordan.
That just came out yesterday. So we do follow CDC guidelines. I'm going to reserve, my personal opinion, but it's a departure from what we've been doing. So I think, there's a lot of buzz going on about, how and why that was written. So we'll be speaking with them and making sure we understand. It doesn't say that you shouldn't, but it's basically given us guidance that it's not necessary. But I think it depends on the circumstance.
Yeah, and I know there are a lot of schools, especially a lot of private schools, that are doing, these sort of tests, at home, sort of, I don't know if at home, but, sort of a quick test, saliva, rapid test. And I know Yale was, or not Yale, but New Haven had rapid testing through the Abbott testing. Would love to hear your thoughts around, what these private schools are. I mean, we're sending our kids to public school, and
Yeah.
there's not enough tests to test everyone every week, unfortunately.
Sure. So it's a great question, and I'm not here to criticize any of those tests. I think more testing than less is critical, and that's one of the reasons why we suffered a pandemic here in the U.S. is that we just didn't have the availability of testing that we do have now. But with regard to that rapid test, that also is a test that has limited sensitivity. So, the reports are anywhere from 10 to 50% sensitivity gaps. So you're going to miss about 10 to 50% of positives. So that test is great if you've got a positive test, because if you're positive, you're most certainly positive for COVID. But if you're negative, there's still some margin of error where you can actually be walking around with active disease, or you could also be positive because you've got recovered disease where you're shedding the virus, which can happen for weeks and in some cases months.
Right. Another topic that that's kind of happening in the Northeast right now, and I guess initially, Florida wasn't letting New Yorkers in, and now it's vice versa. What do you think about the travel ban? And in addition, you have all these students who are coming into colleges. You're at Yale. What is Yale doing? With all these people coming from all over the world and all 50 states coming back on campus?
Great question. That was a hot topic in the Yale community for the past 4 to 6 weeks. And that was in response to Governor Lamont's executive order. And, I want to just clarify, it's not a travel ban, it's a travel advisory. But there is a civil penalty now if you don't follow this advisory. And so what the State Department of Health has done is that every Tuesday, and the list was updated yesterday, and I'm happy to say the list is decreasing in numbers as opposed to increasing, provides a list of states where the case rates are high, and therefore if you've traveled from those states and have spent more than 24 hours in those states and then return or come into Connecticut, you are required to self-quarantine for 14 days. And that is a absolute critical step in keeping our state from having those higher rates. And the number to remember is 10. So if you have a positive rate of more than 10 residents per 100,000, or a positive test rate of 10% or more over a 7-day average. And that's why they choose Tuesday to update the list. Then you're considered a high-risk state. And so what we've done at Yale is we followed that travel advisory. So if you have a faculty member who happens to travel to, let's say, Texas, for whatever reason, upon return, he or she is required to self-quarantine and they can't return to work. And we've done that with the students too that have been coming in throughout the campus, that if they're coming from one of those states, that they have to quarantine.
And I have a very apropos question coming from my dear friend Barbara Monk, talking about an uptick, with the New York Times had this big article today showing all the cases around the country at different colleges. How equipped is the Yale community to deal with an outbreak in the college population?
Yeah, so we've been preparing for this for close to a year now. So we've got an extensive infrastructure for mass testing, which is absolutely critical. We've got an extensive plan for contact tracing in conjunction with the local public health department. And then we've also got, facilities to isolate, students or travelers from within the community. So those are the key elements, is to make sure you could test extensively, do proper contact tracing, and then provide the facilities to isolate those who are at high risk. And that's some of the primary reasons that the virus got out of control throughout the world, is that you didn't have those three components.
Great. We're going to get to vaccines right after this question that I have here. And this is on, you mentioned this to me, which I found super crazy and interesting, the Yale sewage study. Can you elucidate on what Yale is doing with sewage in the state of Connecticut?
Yeah, so Yale actually conducts a number of studies with sewage. This is just one of them, but there's a researcher at Yale who has been testing sewage samples through the public waste plant, and with that sample, they're testing COVID RNA particles. And for those of you who've been reading up on COVID, you know that one of the ways of transmission was through a fecal oral transmission, where people shed virus in their stool. So the concept is, if they're shedding virus in the stool, it will likely be in the sewage. And so we have our scientists who've been plotting the particles at various communities, and have been tracing it to see if there's an uptick. And we've seen little bumps around Connecticut, but fortunately they've been coming back down. But if you trace the historical trends of the sewage levels of COVID, they correlate almost identically to the case rates that we had over the past year. So that's another means for us to monitor and do surveillance for what the prevalence is migrating to throughout Connecticut.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. Yeah, sewage.
It's crazy. Yeah. Big topic: vaccines.
Yeah.
The hopeful savior here. There are four major vaccine candidates right now. Would love to hear your thoughts: timing, efficacy, how you think the whole thing is going to play out to distribute all this vaccine. What are your thoughts?
I don't know. You tell me. It's great. It's a hot topic. They're great questions, very difficult questions. There's over 100 vaccines under trial right now. But the ones you're referring to are the ones that are, in phase 3, or who've received authorization for use. So the only two that I'm aware of approved for use are overseas. There's one in China, one in I believe Russia. But the ones that are actively being trialed right now in phase 3, there's approximately 8 of those, and there's many others in phase 1 and 2. And what's important for the audience to know is that the phase 3 trial is really where you do massive clinical trials of the vaccine with placebo as well. And the number of subjects, volunteers, of course, who are required to complete phase 3 are in the tens of thousands. The two of the top candidates that are getting a lot of publicity are the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine. So right now, the FDA has issued a statement that says that if we have 50% efficacy, that they will issue authorization for use. In order to adequately vaccinate and protect and provide immunity in the community. You've got to vaccinate and provide immunity for roughly 70% of the population. So if you think about that math, it's a little concerning that 70% of the population has to have immunity, but if the virus is only 50% effective, we'd be falling short of that. But one thing to remember is that there'll be a significant number of people who've already, been exposed, have recovered, and theoretically should have immunity. And, we're hoping that these vaccines will be above that minimal threshold of 50%. the production and the supply chain issues is going to be really, really difficult. And, the government has issued, quite a bit of dollars, upwards of billions to these companies in exchange, not just for the R&D process, but also for guaranteeing that they'll have adequate doses for the general population.
Yep, that makes, and I would love to hear your thoughts on, I've heard mRNA, that I think the Pfizer and Moderna are mRNA where they attack the spike,
yeah.
and then maybe the Johnson & Johnson one is the whole virus. Can you explain that to me and everyone listening, kind of what that means and how we decide what and when we should be all taking the vaccine?
Sure. So this is part of the phase 1, 2, and 3 trials. Vaccines have different mechanisms for how they confer immunity. Some vaccines target a certain particle, protein, or portion of a virus, so that your body builds that response. Some vaccines actually are delivered as a attenuated form of the vaccine itself, so a virus itself, meaning that you actually get injected with a weakened or dead particle of that virus, so you build that immunity. But they're all different mechanisms that work, and not one is better than the other as a sort of broad stroke statement. The most important thing is, do these patients develop effective immunity? And do these patients who do get the vaccine, are they free from long-term side effects? So I don't think it's important to look at the mechanism, because we have very effective vaccines that target, one portion of a bacteria or one portion of a virus, or we've got vaccines that, attack the entirety of a particle or a microbe that are just as effective than the ones that, just attack part of it. So the most important thing is, again, to see what these phase 3 clinical trials pan out in terms of results. And, hopefully we'll have that, by the new year. And, we're hoping that that's what's going to happen. It'll be a record time that, such a vaccine gets approved. As you know, it usually takes years.
Yeah. And in terms of, do you think this is in a vaccine that we're all going to need to take every year? Kind of like the flu. I'd be curious also your thoughts on flu and the flu vaccine, and kind of in conjunction with this flu season, I guess. And sort of, is this going to be something that we're going to be taking every year and dealing with like the flu going forward, or is this something that we can fully eradicate?
I think it's a little wishful thinking that, COVID-19 or, SARS-CoV-2 is going to be fully eradicated, unfortunately. I think very much like the flu, it will be likely that we'll have a vaccine, but that, every year that we'll have to have a booster that's modified based on the strain of the virus. And so I think it'll be very much like the flu. So I'm assuming that the vaccines that do get approved will have pretty good efficacy, that you can last through a full year and just get an annual booster. That would be my guess. But it's really hard to say, Sam, because we haven't seen a single vaccine out on the market that's been effective yet. So a lot of this is hopeful anticipation. Some inside info that we're hearing across the industry, but I think likely it'll be an annual booster.
And then in terms of the immune system of young people or seniors, is a vaccine more effective for different age groups or different demographic groups? And who should get this vaccine first? Is it frontline workers, frontline healthcare workers, and then we sort of move from there?
Yes and yes. Certain vaccines are more effective for certain age groups, and that it really is the critical nature of the particularly the phase 2, phase 3 trials. And some of the vaccines currently that are under investigation are actually in the combined phase 2 and 3 trial. I think the Pfizer trial is a combined phase 2 and 3. But we'll have to see if they have equal efficacy. There's a good chance that it won't. And in terms of who do we vaccinate first, absolutely, the higher risk patients or the higher risk populations and those who are at risk because they're exposed, like healthcare workers, should clearly have prioritization for getting vaccination.
Yeah, very much
So
agree.
that'll be another hill that we'll have to climb once the vaccines get approved. It'll be a challenge.
And before I go to our Q&A, we have a lot of great questions here. The most important question of the evening is, are we going to have a football season? Are we going to be able to watch our Jets lose again and again and again? What do you think on?
Well, Sam, as luck would have it, the first year that Tom Brady is not playing in the AFC East, football will be canceled. So, there's no bigger football fan than probably you and I. But I think it would be extremely unlikely to see a football season go through this year, with the full 16-game schedule. I just think the complexity and the nuances of football itself with practice fields, the number of teams traveling back and forth between the country, the size of the facility that's required for these games, I think it'll be extremely difficult. But, we'll see. I mean, I think one indication that was a red flag is that, the Big Ten canceled their football season, weeks ago. And I think the likelihood that, other NCAA leagues or the NFL can, successfully get through a full season is unfortunately pretty low.
Yep, I agree. Yeah. I think the bubbles are working. Lots of testing. Yeah. Everyone stays in one area. That's working. I don't really see how you have a traveling circus.
Nope. Yeah, it'll be tough.
Yeah. All right, so I'm going to move on to some questions. We've got some great questions from the audience. We've had a number on aerosolization and, in particular, HVAC systems. And maybe we'll go back to school here. How do you think about, what procedures and I'd be curious, what you're doing at Yale. And I didn't ask our mask question, so I will get to that after this. But in terms of, some of these devices on the market, circulation of air in an apartment building or in a school, what do we do?
Yeah, so, the thing to remember is that no circulation is bad circulation, right? So if you got stagnant circulation, that puts you at risk if there is someone who's infected, because then those droplets don't have an ability to dissipate into the environment. And that's part of the reason why transmission rates are relatively low when people are outside. Within the hospital, what we have done for patients who are COVID positive is that as much as possible, we put them in what we call a negative pressure room, meaning the air is sucked into the room as opposed to pushed out from the room to the hallway or to neighboring rooms, because that obviously would increase the risk of the virus spreading within the hallway or within the rooms next to each other. But we've in large part the medical community has not found that to be necessary or definitively effective. So there are plenty of patients across the country that were in non-negative pressure rooms, and we did not see transmission within the hospital. Part of that is multifactorial too. We were all wearing masks when we're at work. But I would have to defer that to a bioengineer in terms of what they're doing at the schools in terms of the circulation. But certainly no circulation is not good.
Yeah, and speaking of masks, would love your take on we're both sending young kids to school in 2 weeks. What mask, how should we look at the type of mask? What's the most effective? And I know you mentioned you have a little screen for us here.
So, I'm going to share my screen here, and I think, is that screen up, Sam, the mask screen?
I see it. Yeah.
Okay. So Duke University published a report a couple of weeks ago that gained a lot of public attention. And what they did is they took a series of masks, um, about, exactly 14 masks. In addition, they also tested uh, volunteers that weren't wearing a mask. And they did a study, which some people have criticized, but I think in general it was a pretty good study, looking at the particles that were transmitted while you're wearing various masks. And some masks perform really well, and some masks perform pretty poorly. So if you look on this optic here, number 12, which is the bandana, number 11, which is a ski gaiter. And, I will willingly admit that that was one of the masks I used to wear, particularly when I was running, which I don't do anymore for a number of reasons. And then number 3, which is the knitted mask, those perform poorly compared to these other masks. And one of the distinguishing, features of the other masks that did perform pretty well, and some of them performed almost as well as an N95, a graded hospital healthcare issued N95, is that you've got a seal around the face. I'll sort of take this off here, but the most important thing is to get a mask that has a relatively good seal around the nasal bridge and certainly around the mouth. And just, as you can imagine, those gaiters, those bandanas, and a lot of the knitted masks, because they're so flat, don't provide a nice seal. So, my kids will, wear, those disposable surgical masks, which, have a aluminum foil that will help the seal, or they'll wear a form-fitted cotton mask. And, if you're going to wear a cotton mask, it's important to wash those every day because, they get a lot of debris. And, you got to remember, it's not just COVID. There's a lot of other viruses and bacteria out there that, that can be clinging onto those surfaces. But, I would recommend not wearing a bandana or a gaiter or a loose fitted hand sewn mask.
Perfect. Would love to hear your thoughts. We've hung out a bunch this summer. You've told me this summer this is a time to go outside and hang out with your friends at a distance, at a small distance. You're at my patio, or on a boat, whatever.
I just want to go on record that we're only outside, Sam.
That is 100% correct, Steve. 100% correct. What else do you do? Do you do in your practice? Do you go to grocery stores? What are you doing, and sort of what are you planning on doing this fall and winter to keep your family safe?
Right.
And also, we have another quick little question here on diet, exercise, any other type of proactive measures,
Absolutely.
I've been taking those little packets every day.
Yep.
What are you doing to sort of stay safe and prepare for this dark period?
COVID is unique, but it is another respiratory virus, and just like other respiratory viruses, your body has an immune response that can be boosted and better prepared to tolerate an exposure as well as enduring an infection or an active infection. So all those things that you mentioned, eating well, getting good sleep, making sure that you practice vigilant hand hygiene. And for those of you who do believe in it, I do. I'm not promoting any particular product, but I do take immune boosters almost daily, particularly in the winter, or when I have been traveling or traveling in the past. So anything that you would normally do to fight the flu or the common day cold, this is time to do it. In terms of grocery shopping, some people will shop in person if you're going to do that, and I do that periodically. I like to do it in bulk. So if you're going to go shop and expose yourself, though it should be a minimal exposure, because I don't think there's any day soon where people who are in supermarkets are not going to be required to wear a mask. The exposure is still minimal, but there's still exposure. If you're going to go into a supermarket, just bulk up on your groceries so that you're not going repeatedly. Because if you go, 4 times a week to get the same amount that you could do in one stop, then you're exposing yourself unnecessarily. And I do a combination of grocery shopping online, and then I'll go in and get some fresh produce for the week. But I try to minimize it as much as possible, and that's what I would recommend for everyone else.
I have a question here on, it's an interesting one on vaccines. Do you know of anything in the current pipeline on T cell or B cell immunity as opposed to antibody immunity, which seems to be, kind of what the major ones that I've heard of are focused on?
Yeah, so those are different cells in your immune system that will attack and confer immunity. The T cells tend to, be the ones that rapidly attack an exposure, and the B cells, provide long-term immunity. But there's a number of those that are being tested right now, and there's a number of studies with the convalescent plasma to look at both T cells and B cells. But I don't know of any specific product that's about to emerge, but I know there's quite a number of pharmaceuticals that are looking at both of those strategies.
Going back to some earlier questions, and we have about 8 minutes. We'll sort of run through questions. There are a lot more questions that we can answer here, and maybe we can sort of have a follow up. I'm going to try to see if I can collect these questions here if possible. And Dr. Choi, sorry, I might bother you to
not at all.
One question coming from my cousin Sydney Zelson, who's listening in the audience here. Youth sports. Colleges are canceling a lot of things, but there was Little League this summer. There was summer camp. How do you think about youth sports, in particular, youth contact sports, this fall and winter?
Well, at the risk of getting lots of hate email and text, it poses a big risk for youth sports, particularly with younger kids who, can't abide by mask wearing. But certainly contact sports will, pose a greater risk for exposure for someone who's potentially infected, right? So it's really hard to do that for a contact sport. It's very different if you're playing a sport that you can, socially distance. And, baseball happens to be one of them where, the individual players aren't on top of each other. But, even with baseball, the risk is, if they're all sitting in the dugout or on a bench within 6 feet of each other and not appropriately wearing a mask or taking off the mask, to have a drink of water or sports drink or talking, and certainly yelling and coughing and spitting. All those are, very high aerosol generating procedures. Much like, some of the risks that they've described for people who are in synagogues and churches and temples or places of worship, where, singing is a, sort of primary activity. That's a high risk, high aerosol generating activity, and so that becomes one of those typical super spreader events. And we saw that last spring in New Rochelle. We saw that in a couple cases in South Korea. So sports are similar, and particularly the sports that are going to be indoors. So if they're playing indoor basketball, it's a risk. So, I don't think there's any mitigating factor or behavior or intervention that's going to eliminate all risk. I think parents just need to weigh the risk benefit. But I would say contact sports in particular pose a much higher risk.
And you travel. We have a question here on, should I take my holiday this year? Getting in an airplane.
Yes. Take the holiday, just don't go on an airplane. It's absolutely critical for people to take time off. Myself included. This is my second vacation day since Christmas. So I think this is where you become creative. You do staycations and you stay at home with your family or your loved ones, and you do things in the backyard, or you do things, in the local community that are outdoors. But I would highly advise against traveling. If you're going to travel and you need to get out, then, look at that advisory link and make sure you go to a state or a location that has a low rate and a low prevalence, because you'll be exposing yourself and your family potentially to other individuals in that community that are infected and are carrying the virus or have recovered and can still shed active virus.
I mean, on airplane travel, I know there's talk that the airplane, there's so much circulation in an airplane, but a lot of the airlines are still don't have the middle seats covered. Have there been, on the contact tracing side, what's been sort of the prevalence of getting it from travel, I guess, from point leaving your house, going through the airport, going on an airplane and getting to your destination? Is that one of the causes that's sort of caused some of the spike in the country?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. People who are traveling, whether it's definitively from the presence of that individual at a crowded airport or sitting in an airplane, and certainly, absolutely, certainly, people coming from those high-risk states, it's clearly been a source of identification when they do contact tracing. It's high risk, and you got to remember, it's about the number of people that you're exposed to, the distancing or the lack of distancing that you have between those people, and the duration of that exposure. So if you think about an airplane is the perfect location for a virus to spread through a group of people. You're on a plane for hours. You're on top of each other, and there's often a lot of people on an airplane. If you're fortunate enough to fly privately, yeah, but if you're on a commercial airline, you're talking about, hundreds of people potentially on a flight, or, certainly dozens. So it breaks, all three rules, people, distance, and duration.
Last question, and this was, is from Ralph Falkenstein. SARS-CoV-2 is a mainly a respiratory virus. What did you see during the peak of COVID affecting other parts of the body, heart, kidney, and other organs?
Well, you named the two primary ones, other than the lungs, but that's probably one of the more scary aspects of this virus. It's only now that we're seeing the long-term sequelae. So, kidneys is a huge vulnerability in terms of an organ suffering other consequences outside of lungs. Definitely attacks the heart. We've seen liver dysfunction. We've seen neurological sequelae, and we've seen muscular impact from it as well. So those are all common sequelae of patients who have severe active disease. And some of the more devastating consequences include people who've lost smell and taste, which is devastating. And we have cases where it still hasn't come back for a number of patients. And if you're like me, that would be devastating too.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna let you in on a not such a dour note. With final words of wisdom. But first, I really want to thank the Yale Alumni Health Network, Yale Alumni Association. Thank you all so much for joining us in this talk. Accelerate Yale and Yale Angels. We've been doing these webinars since I guess mid-March now. Steve, I think you were the second one that we did. We've probably done 17, 18. I don't even know how many, but it's really been great to try to keep the community together during this very challenging time. And so thank you all so much for joining us. Steve, any final words of wisdom for the audience here?
Wear your mask, be safe, and take care of each other.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Choi. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Right. And everyone, take care. Have a good night.
Right. Great to see you, Sam.
Good.